The apartment smelled like stale coffee and resignation. David Brennan sat at the kitchen table, the same scratched formica table he'd bought at a yard sale 23 years ago, back when he still believed furniture was temporary, that better days were coming. The morning light struggled through windows he hadn't properly cleaned in months, casting pale rectangles across the linoleum floor. Dust motes drifted through the beams like tiny ghosts, suspended in air that felt too thick to breathe. 57 years old. That's what the calendar said, what his driver's license confirmed, what the mirror showed him every morning with increasing cruelty. But inside David felt like 100, maybe older. There's an exhaustion that comes not from work, but from the absence of it. From the knowledge that you've spent decades moving in circles, that all the motion added up to nothing, that you've arrived at late middle age with nothing to show for the journey except regrets and the bitter certainty that you wasted it all. His hands wrapped around a chipped mug, ceramic white with a faded logo from a plumbing supply company he'd worked for in the 90s. The coffee inside had gone cold an hour ago, maybe 2. Time had a way of slipping past him these days, unmarked and unmourned. He couldn't remember when he'd made it. The clock on the microwave blinked 11:47 a.m. in green digital certainty, but it felt like it could be any time, any day. They all blurred together now. Outside, Portland rain hammered against the windows with the relentless persistence that defined Oregon autumns. The sound was white noise, constant and numbing. Somewhere in the building a door slammed. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Purposeful going somewhere, belonging to someone who probably had somewhere to be, someone to see, something that mattered. David had nowhere to be. Hadn't for 3 years now. The mail slot rattled. It was such a small sound, barely audible over the rain, but it cut through David's fog like a knife. He didn't move at first. Mail meant bills mostly, collection notices, credit card offers designed for desperate people. Occasionally a flyer for a pizza place that had closed 2 years ago, caught in some eternal mailing list loop. Nothing worth getting up for, but something made him rise from the table. Maybe it was the way the sound had pierced his stupor. Maybe it was simply that his body needed to move after sitting motionless for so long. Maybe on some level he couldn't quite name. He sensed that this moment was different, that the ordinary percussion of mail through metal was about to mean something. His knees protested as he stood. 57 wasn't old, not really, but he'd spent the last 3 years treating his body like a prison he was trying to escape through neglect. He shuffled to the front door in slippers that had long since lost their shape, bending with effort to retrieve the small pile of envelopes scattered across the worn doormat. Junk. Bill, coupon, circular. More junk. And then a cream-colored envelope, heavier than the others. Real paper, quality stock. His name written in elegant script across the front. Not printed, not typed, but handwritten with the kind of careful penmanship that nobody bothered with anymore. The return address was from a law firm in Seattle, Carmichael and Associates, attorneys at law. David's heart stuttered. He knew that firm. He'd dealt with them 3 years ago during the worst months of his life, when everything fell apart. When Sarah, he couldn't finish the thought. To even now, even after all this time, her name was a blade that turned in his chest. His hands trembled as he tore open the envelope, heedless of preservation, desperate to know what ghost from his past had reached out to haunt him. Inside was a single folded letter on matching cream paper, and beneath it something else, a smaller sealed envelope. Ivory with his name written on it in handwriting he would have recognized blind in the dark in death. Sarah's handwriting. The room tilted. David grabbed the doorframe, his vision swimming, his breath coming in short gasps that didn't seem to reach his lungs. This wasn't possible. Sarah had been dead for 3 years. 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days. He knew because he'd counted every single one. Because each morning he woke up surprised and disappointed, to find himself still alive when she wasn't. The letter from the law firm fell from his numb fingers and drifted to the floor. David stared at the smaller envelope, at the loops and curves of letters that spelled out his name in Sarah's distinctive hand, and felt something crack open inside his chest, something he'd kept locked and sealed and buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it didn't exist anymore. Hope hurt worse than despair ever had. The thing about waste is that you rarely see it happening in real time. It accumulates slowly, like sediment, like rust, like the grey that creeps into your hair one strand at a time, until one day you look in the mirror and don't recognize the person staring back. David Brennan had been a carpenter once, a good one. No, scratch that. He'd been a great one, the kind of craftsman who could look at a piece of raw lumber and see the finished product hiding inside it, waiting to be released. His hands had known how to coax beauty from wood, how to join pieces so seamlessly you couldn't see where one ended and another began. He'd built staircases that were works of art, cabinetry that made homeowners weep with gratitude, decks that seemed to grow organically from the houses they adjoined. He'd had talent, he'd had skill, he'd had everything he needed to build a life as solid and beautiful as the things he created. And somehow, despite all of that, he'd pissed it all away. The workshop in the garage had been his sanctuary once. 10 by 20 feet of organized chaos, every tool in its place, sawdust perpetually coating every surface, despite his best efforts to keep things clean. The smell of cedar and pine and walnut, the satisfying rasp of a hand-plane shaving paper-thin curls from a board, the quiet focus required to measure twice and cut once, all of it had been his meditation, his prayer, his purpose. Sarah used to bring him coffee in the evenings, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching him work with a smile that said she understood what he was doing, even if she couldn't name it. She never complained about the time he spent in the garage, never nagged him about neglected household chores or social obligations. She got it. She understood that some men need to create things with their hands to feel whole. "You're going to build us a castle?" she'd teased once, early in their marriage, watching him obsess over the details of a jewelry box he was making for her birthday. One board at a time, one perfect joint at a time, until we're living in a fortress of your perfectionism. He'd laughed, pulling her close, getting sawdust in her hair. "Would you live in my castle, princess?" "I'd live anywhere with you, David Brennan, even in a cardboard box." But she'd never had to test that promise because David had provided. Not extravagantly, they'd never been rich, but comfortably. His reputation as a craftsman had brought steady work. Custom furniture commissions, restoration projects, the occasional high-end remodel for clients who appreciated quality and were willing to pay for it, and then, David could never quite pinpoint when it started going wrong. There was no single moment, no catastrophic failure, just a slow erosion like water wearing away stone. A job he turned down because he was tired. A client he disappointed because he'd lost focus. A deadline he missed because he'd spent the night drinking instead of working. Small things, forgivable things, until they weren't. The recession hit in 2008, and suddenly nobody wanted custom cabinetry or hand-built staircases. They wanted cheap and fast, flat-pack furniture from big box stores, the kind of soulless construction that David had spent his career trying to transcend. Work dried up. Money got tight. And instead of adapting, instead of finding new ways to use his skills, David had retreated into bitterness and self-pity, and the kind of drinking that starts as social lubricant and ends as daily necessity. Sarah had taken a job as a receptionist at a dental office. It wasn't much, but it kept them afloat. She never threw it in his face, never made him feel small for the fact that his wife was supporting them while he slowly pickled himself in cheap whiskey and resentment. She just kept showing up, to work, to their marriage, to the life they'd built together, even as David systematically dismantled his half of it. "It's temporary," she'd said, kissing his forehead one morning as she left for work. Him still in bed at 9 a.m., the room reeking of last night's bourbon. Things will turn around. But they hadn't, because David hadn't let them. He could have retrained, could have gotten his contractor's license and moved into management, could have taught woodworking at the community college. They'd actually offered him a position in 2011, and he'd turned it down because he was too proud to admit he needed help, too convinced that his real career was just around the corner, that any day now the phone would ring with a commission that would justify all the waiting. The call never came. Instead, Sarah got sick. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. The kind that's already won by the time you know you're in the fight. 18 months from diagnosis to death, and David spent most of them in a fog of denial and guilt so thick he could barely see her suffering through it. She'd needed him to be strong, to be present, to hold her hand and tell her it would be okay even when they both knew it wouldn't. She'd needed him to be the man she'd married, the craftsman who could build something beautiful even from broken pieces. He'd failed her. Again. Oh, he'd been there physically, sitting in hospital rooms, driving her to treatments, mechanically going through the motions of caregiving. But emotionally, spiritually, he'd been absent, checked out, already grieving the loss of his own dreams so thoroughly that he had nothing left to give to the woman who'd stood by him through every failure, every disappointment, every self-inflicted wound. The last coherent conversation they'd had 3 days before she died haunted him still. Sarah had been lucid that morning, a brief window of clarity before the morphine took her back under. She'd reached for his hand with fingers that felt like bird bones, her skin paper-thin and cold despite the blankets piled on the hospital bed. "David," she'd whispered, her voice a threadbare shadow of what it had been. "Promise me something." "Anything," he'd said, and meant it, because promising costs nothing when you know you won't have to deliver. "Promise me you won't waste what's left." He'd stared at her, not understanding. What's left? She was dying. What could possibly be left? "Your life, David. Promise me you won't waste your life," he'd promised. Of course he'd promised. You don't refuse a dying woman's last request. You nod and squeeze her hand and tell her whatever she needs to hear to find peace. And then she was gone, and David discovered that he'd lied, because he'd spent the 3 years since her death doing exactly what she'd begged him not to do. Wasting it, all of it, every single day. He'd sold the house, their house, the one with the workshop where he'd built 1,000 dreams. Couldn't afford the mortgage on his own, couldn't bear to walk past the empty spaces where Sarah used to be. He'd moved into the shitty apartment in southeast Portland, a place so generic it could have been anywhere, inhabited by anyone, meaning nothing. The workshop tools went to auction. Every hand plane, every chisel, every saw. Sold for pennies on the dollar to dealers and hobbyists who would never understand what they represented, would never know that each piece had been selected with the kind of care most people reserve for choosing a spouse. David had told himself he needed the money. The truth was he couldn't stand to look at them anymore. They represented who he'd been, who he could have been, and the gap between the two was too painful to contemplate. He'd tried to work, briefly. Took a job at a big box home improvement store, wearing an orange apron and helping weekend warriors find the right size screws for their amateur projects. It had lasted 6 weeks, 6 humiliating, soul-crushing weeks of watching people buy cheap garbage, while he bit his tongue to keep from explaining why everything they were doing was wrong, why their deck would fail in 3 years, why their shelves would sag and their cabinets would crack and none of it would last, because they'd chosen convenience over craftsmanship. After that, nothing. Social Security disability for depression. A diagnosis he'd sought specifically to avoid working, to justify his complete withdrawal from the world. It paid just enough to cover rent and groceries and the endless bottles of bottom-shelf vodka that helped him sleep through days that had no purpose, no shape, no meaning. 3 years. 3 years of his life disappeared into a haze of television reruns and delivery food, and the kind of bone-deep loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from knowing you deserve to be. He'd become exactly what Sarah had feared he would. A waste. A man-shaped void. And now, standing in his apartment with rain hammering the windows and a letter from his dead wife in his shaking hands, David Brennan finally understood what she'd been trying to tell him. Don't waste what's left, not what's left of her, what's left of him. But she'd never had to test that promise because David had provided. Not extravagantly. They'd never been rich, but comfortably. His reputation as a craftsman had brought steady work. Custom furniture commissions, restoration projects, the occasional high-end remodel for clients who appreciated quality and were willing to pay for it. And then. David could never quite pinpoint when it started going wrong. There was no single moment, no catastrophic failure, just a slow erosion like water wearing away stone, a job he turned down because he was tired, a client he disappointed because he'd lost focus, a deadline he missed because he'd spent the night drinking instead of working. Small things, forgivable things, until they weren't. The recession hit in 2008, and suddenly nobody wanted custom cabinetry or hand-built staircases. They wanted cheap and fast, flat-pack furniture from big box stores, the kind of soulless construction that David had spent his career trying to transcend. Work dried up, money got tight, and instead of adapting, instead of finding new ways to use his skills, David had retreated into bitterness and self-pity, and the kind of drinking that starts as social lubricant and ends as daily necessity. Sarah had taken a job as a receptionist at a dental office. It wasn't much, but it kept them afloat. She never threw it in his face, never made him feel small for the fact that his wife was supporting them, while he slowly pickled himself in cheap whiskey and resentment. She just kept showing up, to work, to their marriage, to the life they'd built together, even as David systematically dismantled his half of it. "It's temporary," she'd said, kissing his forehead one morning as she left for work, him still in bed at 9 a.m., the room reeking of last night's bourbon. "Things will turn around." But they hadn't, because David hadn't let them. He could have retrained, could have gotten his contractor's license and moved into management, could have taught woodworking at the community college. They'd actually offered him a position in 2011, and he'd turned it down because he was too proud to admit he needed help, too convinced that his real career was just around the corner, that any day now the phone would ring with a commission that would justify all the waiting. The call never came. Instead, Sarah got sick. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The kind that's already won by the time you know you're in the fight. 18 months from diagnosis to death, and David spent most of them in a fog of denial and guilt so thick he could barely see her suffering through it. She'd needed him to be strong, to be present, to hold her hand and tell her it would be okay even when they both knew it wouldn't. She'd needed him to be the man she'd married, the craftsman who could build something beautiful even from broken pieces. He'd failed her, again. Oh, he'd been there physically, sitting in hospital rooms, driving her to treatments, mechanically going through the motions of caregiving. But emotionally, spiritually, he'd been absent, checked out, already grieving the loss of his own dreams so thoroughly that he had nothing left to give to the woman who'd stood by him through every failure, every disappointment, every self-inflicted wound. The last coherent conversation they'd had, 3 days before she died, haunted him still. Sarah had been lucid that morning, a brief window of clarity before the morphine took her back under. She'd reached for his hand with fingers that felt like bird bones, her skin paper-thin and cold, despite the blankets piled on the hospital bed. "David," she'd whispered, her voice a threadbare shadow of what it had been. "Promise me something." "Anything," he'd said and meant it, because promising costs nothing when you know you won't have to deliver. "Promise me you won't waste what's left." He'd stared at her, not understanding. What's left? She was dying. What could possibly be left? "Your life, David. Promise me you won't waste your life." He'd promised. Of course he'd promised. You don't refuse a dying woman's last request. You nod and squeeze her hand and tell her whatever she needs to hear to find peace. And then she was gone, and David discovered that he'd lied, because he'd spent the 3 years since her death doing exactly what she'd begged him not to do, wasting it, all of it, every single day. He'd sold the house, their house, the one with the workshop where he'd built 1,000 dreams, couldn't afford the mortgage on his own, couldn't bear to walk past the empty spaces where Sarah used to be. He'd moved into the shitty apartment in southeast Portland, a place so generic it could have been anywhere, inhabited by anyone, meaning nothing. The workshop tools went to auction. Every hand plane, every chisel, every saw. Sold for pennies on the dollar to dealers and hobbyists who would never understand what they represented, would never know that each piece had been selected with the kind of care most people reserve for choosing a spouse. David had told himself he needed the money. The truth was he couldn't stand to look at them anymore. They represented who he'd been, who he could have been, and the gap between the two was too painful to contemplate. He'd tried to work, briefly. Took a job at a big box home improvement store, wearing an orange apron and helping weekend warriors find the right size screws for their amateur projects. It had lasted 6 weeks. 6 humiliating, soul-crushing weeks of watching people buy cheap garbage, while he bit his tongue to keep from explaining why everything they were doing was wrong, why their deck would fail in 3 years, why their shelves would sag and their cabinets would crack and none of it would last because they'd chosen convenience over craftsmanship. After that, nothing. Social Security disability for depression. Their diagnosis he'd sought specifically to avoid working, to justify his complete withdrawal from the world. It paid just enough to cover rent and groceries and the endless bottles of bottom-shelf vodka that helped him sleep through days that had no purpose, no shape, no meaning. 3 years. 3 years of his life disappeared into a haze of television reruns and delivery food, and the kind of bone-deep loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from knowing you deserve to be. He'd become exactly what Sarah had feared he would. A waste. A man-shaped void. And now, standing in his apartment with rain hammering the windows and a letter from his dead wife in his shaking hands, David Brennan finally understood what she'd been trying to tell him. Don't waste what's left. Not what's left of her. What's left of him. Act 3. The discovery words from the grave. David couldn't open the envelope at first. He'd carried it from the door to the kitchen table, set it down like it might explode, circled it for 10 minutes like it was a snake coiled on his formica. The letter from the law firm lay forgotten on the floor by the door. All that mattered was the smaller envelope, the one with his name in Sarah's handwriting, the one that shouldn't exist but did. Outside, the rain intensified. Thunder rumbled somewhere over the West Hills, a low growl that rattled the windows in their frames. The apartment's fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, but held. David barely noticed. His entire universe had contracted to a 3-by-5-inch rectangle of ivory paper. His hands still trembled. He clenched them into fists, released, clenched again. Breathing exercises. Sarah had taught him those years ago, when his anxiety about work had started keeping him up at night. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out. It didn't help. Nothing was going to help except opening the goddamn letter. But what if it was terrible? What if Sarah's last words were an indictment, a final reckoning of all his failures? What if she'd written it knowing he'd turn out exactly as he had, pathetic, broken, wasted, and wanted to make sure he knew how disappointed she was? Or worse, what if it was kind? What if she'd written words of love and forgiveness that he didn't deserve and couldn't earn and would have to carry forever as proof of how thoroughly he'd failed the one person who'd believed in him? David sat down heavily in the chair he'd occupied all morning. The coffee mug was still there, still cold. He pushed it aside and reached for the envelope with fingers that felt disconnected from his body, like he was puppeteering his own hands from a distance. The seal broke with a soft tearing sound. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. Sarah's handwriting covered both sides in her neat economical script. The date at the top read April 3rd, 2 weeks before she died. 2 weeks before David had sat by her bed and made a promise he wouldn't keep. He took a breath. Another. Then he unfolded the paper and began to read. My dearest David, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you about this letter in person. But I know you, my love. You would have fought me on it. You would have told me I was being morbid, that we shouldn't talk about after. You would have changed the subject with that charming deflection you've perfected over the years, the one that makes people think you're fine when we both know you're drowning. So I'm writing this in secret, with Marcia's help. Yes, Marcia knows. I made her promise not to tell you until enough time had passed. I hope you're not angry with her. She only agreed because she loves you almost as much as I do. I need to tell you something, David. Something I should have said a long time ago but didn't, because I was trying to protect you, and in protecting you I think I may have done more harm than good. You think you wasted your life. I know you do. I can see it in your eyes when you think I'm not looking, hear it in the silences between your words. You believe that your worth was tied up in your work, and when the work disappeared, so did your purpose. You think you failed me by not being the provider, the craftsman, the man you set out to be. My darling, you're wrong. You're so wrong it breaks my heart that I won't be there to spend the rest of your life proving it to you. Do you remember the jewelry box you made me for my birthday? The one with the secret compartment? I've kept something in that compartment for 20 years, David. Letters. Dozens of them. Letters from people whose lives you touched, whose homes you built, whose spaces you transformed. Letters from clients thanking you, not just for beautiful work, but for your kindness, your patience, your willingness to listen to what they needed and translate it into reality. You were never just a carpenter, David. You were an artist who made people's dreams tangible. You gave families gathering places. You built cribs for babies and hope chests for marriages and bookcases that would hold generations of memories. Every single thing you created was a gift to the world, and you treated each project like it mattered, because to you, it did. But that's not why I'm writing this letter. I'm writing because I need you to understand something crucial. Your purpose didn't end when the recession hit. It didn't end when you got depressed or when work dried up or even when I got sick. Your purpose is still there, waiting for you. You just have to choose to see it. I've left instructions with Marcia. There's money. Not a lot, but enough. Money I saved over the years specifically for this. And there's a list. A very specific list of things I need you to do for me. Not huge things. Not building castles or monuments. Just small acts of creation and connection that I can't do anymore because I'll be gone. These aren't suggestions, David. They're not gentle recommendations. This is what I'm asking you to do with what's left. Not for me, for you. Because I know that if you complete this list, you'll remember who you are. You'll remember that waste isn't measured by economic output or career success. It's measured by connection, by presence, by the small acts of love and craft that make the world a little more beautiful. I can't force you. Even from beyond the grave, I can't make you do this. But I'm asking, my darling. I'm begging. Don't waste what's left. Not because I said so, but because you deserve better than the half-life you've been living. Build for me, David. One last time. Build the life you were always meant to have. With all my love across all distances, Sarah P.S. The jewelry box is in storage. Unit 247 at Secure Store on Powell. The key is with Marcia. Go get it. Read the letters, then read my list. And please, my love, don't overthink this. Just trust me. Trust that I knew what I was doing when I wrote this. Trust that everything I'm asking you to do is possible and necessary and exactly what you need. Now stop crying and go call Marcia. David realized he was crying only when a tear fell onto the paper, smudging the ink of Sarah's signature. He wiped at his face with the back of his hand, succeeding only in smearing the wetness across his cheeks. His breath came in hitching gasps, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. Grief and hope and shame and love all tangled together into a knot that felt like it might choke him. She'd known. Of course she'd known. Sarah had always been able to see through his bullshit, had always understood him better than he understood himself, even dying, even in pain, even when she'd had every right to focus solely on her own suffering. She'd been thinking about him, planning for him, trying to save him from himself. The letter trembled in his hands. He read it again. Then a third time. Each pass revealed new layers, new implications. The jewelry box with the secret compartment, he'd forgotten about that, hadn't thought about it in years. It had been one of his early pieces, made shortly after they'd gotten married. Cherry wood with dovetail joints and a hidden drawer that released with a specific pattern of pressure. He'd been so proud of it, the way the mechanism worked perfectly, invisible unless you knew where to look. She'd kept it. Of course she'd kept it. Sarah had never thrown away anything he'd made, even when they'd downsized, even when space was tight. His creations had been scattered throughout their home like shrines to the man he used to be, and she'd been collecting letters, testimonials from clients. For 20 years, David couldn't wrap his mind around it. Why would she do that? What possible purpose could it serve? To prove to you that you mattered, whispered a voice in his head that sounded remarkably like Sarah's. To show you that your work had value beyond the paycheck, that you touched lives in ways you never acknowledged. The law firm letter. David suddenly remembered it, scrambled up from the table and grabbed it from where it had fallen by the door. His vision was still blurred with tears, but he managed to scan the contents. Dear Mr. Brennan, as per the instructions of Mrs. Sarah Brennan, we are delivering to you a sealed letter that was entrusted to our care prior to her passing. Per her specific requests, This letter was to be held for a period of 3 years following her death before being sent to you. Additionally, Mrs. Brennan established a small trust fund of $15,000 to be administered by her friend Marcia Chen, with specific instructions that the funds be used solely for purposes outlined in her letter to you. Ms. Chen has been informed of this delivery and expects your contact. We extend our condolences for your loss. Should you have any questions regarding this matter, please do not hesitate to contact our office. Sincerely, Robert Carmichael and Associates, $15,000, a list of tasks, a jewelry box full of letters, and Marcia Chen, Sarah's best friend since college, who had barely spoken to David since the funeral, not out of anger, he realized now, but because she'd been keeping a secret, a 3-year secret. David's hands shook as he pulled his cell phone from his pocket. It was an old model, a flip phone from 2015 that barely functioned, but served its minimal purpose of occasional calls. He hadn't used it in weeks. The battery was nearly dead. He plugged it in and waited for it to boot up, drumming his fingers on the table, impatience rising like a tide. Sarah's letter sat in front of him, the words blurring and sharpening as his eyes tried to focus through the tears that kept coming no matter how many times he wiped them away. Don't waste what's left. The phone finally came to life with a series of beeps. David scrolled through the contacts, a pitiful list, mostly outdated numbers for people he'd lost touch with years ago. But there, near the bottom, Marcia Chen, Sarah's friend. He hit the call button before he could overthink it. It rang 3 times, 4. David was about to hang up, assuming she was at work or had changed her number, when the line clicked open. David? Marcia's voice was cautious, surprised. Is that really you? Hi, Marcia. His voice came out rough, gravelly. I got the letter. A pause. Then softly. Good. It's about damn time. Marcia Chen lived in a tidy craftsman bungalow in the Selwood neighborhood, the kind of house that David would have killed to own back when he cared about such things. Freshly painted in sage green with white trim, a well-maintained garden with late-season chrysanthemums still blooming despite the rain, and a front porch that begged for a rocking chair and a summer evening. David stood on that porch 30 minutes after calling her, soaked to the skin because he'd walked the 3 miles from his apartment without thinking to grab an umbrella or even a jacket. His clothes clung to him, cold and heavy. His hair was plastered to his skull. Water dripped from his nose and chin onto the welcome mat. He must have looked like hell, a drowned rat version of a man who already looked like he'd given up on life. The door opened before he could knock. Marcia stood in the doorway, older than David remembered, but still recognizably herself. Late 50s, graying hair cut in a practical bob, wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater. Her eyes were red-rimmed, like she'd been crying, or maybe like she'd expected this day for 3 years and had held it together until now. Jesus Christ, David, she said, and pulled him inside. 20 minutes later, David sat on Marcia's couch wearing borrowed sweatpants and a t-shirt that said, Portland Marathon 2019 across the chest. His wet clothes tumbled in the dryer in the next room. A mug of hot tea was pressed into his hands, some kind of herbal thing that smelled like chamomile and honey. He hadn't protested when Marcia had practically forced it on him, too numb and overwhelmed to care. The jewelry box sat on the coffee table between them. It was exactly as David remembered it, though perhaps more beautiful than his memory had preserved. Cherry wood aged to a deep amber, the grain flowing across the surface like water frozen in wood. The dovetail joints at the corners were invisible unless you looked closely, each tail fitting so perfectly into its socket that the box appeared to be carved from a single piece. The lid had a simple brass hinge and clasp, elegant in its restraint. He'd been 27 when he made this, young, arrogant in his certainty that he'd found his calling. Every cut had been measured 3 times, every joint tested and retested. He'd spent 60 hours on something that should have taken 20, obsessing over microscopic imperfections that only he could see. Sarah had loved it anyway, had called it the most beautiful thing anyone had ever made for her. She kept it on her dresser for 20 years, Marcia said quietly. Even at the end, when we had to move her to hospice, she made me promise to put it in storage exactly as she'd instructed. She was very specific about it, Said you'd need to see it yourself in your own time. David couldn't speak. He reached out, traced the edge of the box with one finger. The wood was smooth, perfectly finished. His younger self had known what he was doing. "Open it," Marcia prompted gently. He pressed the clasp. It released with a soft click, still perfectly functional after all these years, and the lid swung open on hinges that didn't squeak. Inside was the red velvet lining he'd installed, still vibrant. Sarah's jewelry was gone. Presumably she'd worn it or given it away before she died. But the box wasn't empty. It was full of paper, letters. Dozens of them, maybe 100, folded and stacked with the same neat precision that Sarah brought to everything. Different types of stationery, different handwriting, different dates spanning 2 decades. David pulled out the top letter with shaking hands. The paper was expensive, cream-colored linen. The handwriting was flowing, feminine. "Dear Mr. Brennan, I wanted to write and thank you for the bookshelf you built for our daughter's room. When we commissioned it, I thought it was just going to be a nice piece of furniture. I had no idea it would become the centerpiece of her childhood. Emma is 8 now, and every night we sit on the floor in front of that bookshelf, and she chooses a book for bedtime. She's already read most of them twice. She knows exactly where each one belongs. She started organizing them by color, then by size, then by which ones make her laugh versus which ones make her cry. That bookshelf isn't just storage, it's become part of her daily ritual, part of how she makes sense of the world. My husband and I have talked about how we'll never get rid of it. When Emma goes to college, we'll keep it exactly as it is. When she gets married, we'll give it to her for her own home, for her own children. Your work will be passed down through generations of our family. Thank you for caring about the details. Thank you for making something that will outlast all of us. With gratitude, Jennifer Morrison. David's hands trembled as he set the letter aside and reached for another, then another. Each one was similar, a note of thanks, a story of how something he'd built had become part of someone's life. A dining table where a family gathered for 20 years of holidays, a crib that held 3 siblings and then became an heirloom, a deck where a couple got engaged, where children learned to walk, where grandparents watched sunsets. Things he'd made, lives he'd touched, meaning he'd created and then forgotten because he'd been too busy measuring his worth by billable hours and bank balances. She collected these, Marcia said, her voice thick with emotion. Every time a client sent a thank you note, she saved it. She told me once that she knew you'd need them someday, that you'd forget what your work meant, and you'd need proof. David couldn't see the letters anymore. His vision was too blurred. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, trying to stop the tears, but they came anyway, hot, bitter, overwhelming. Great gasping sobs that he couldn't control, that came from somewhere so deep inside him he hadn't known it existed. "I threw it all away," he choked out. "All of it. The tools, the workshop, everything. I sold it all and gave up and now you're going to get it back," Marcia said firmly. She reached across the coffee table and gripped his wrist, hard enough to hurt, hard enough to anchor him. Not the same tools, not the same workshop, but the same purpose, David. That never went anywhere, you just forgot where you put it. She released his wrist and reached into her pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "Sarah's list. She made me promise not to give it to you until you'd read the letters. She wanted you to remember who you were before you tried to figure out who you could still be." David took the paper with numb fingers. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely unfold it. The list was written in Sarah's handwriting, numbered 1 through 7, David's Purpose Project 1. Repair the fence at Riverside Community Garden. They've needed it for years. 2. Build a bench for the bus stop on 82nd and Division. You know the one, where elderly people wait in the rain. 3. Make a toy chest for Clara Rodriguez, daughter of Manuel Rodriguez, your old client. She's 3 now. 4. Restore the wooden sign at St. Michael's Church. Father Tom has been asking for help. 5. Build a wheelchair ramp for Mrs. Henshaw on Cedar Street. She's elderly and housebound. 6. Create a memorial box for the Parkside Senior Center for residents to store letters to deceased loved ones. 7. Teach one person, anyone, your craft. Pass it on. Budget $15,000. Marcia has the account details. Timeline, No rush, but also no excuses. Start tomorrow. Remember, this isn't charity. This is you remembering that building things isn't just a job, it's how you love the world. David stared at the list. 7 things. 7 relatively simple projects that would cost more in time than money, that required his hands and his skill and his presence in the world. 7 ways to matter again. I don't have tools, he said, and immediately felt ridiculous. Of all the objections he could have raised, I'm not capable, I've been drunk for 3 years, I can't remember how to make a dovetail joint. He'd gone with the most practical one. Marcia smiled, sad but knowing. Sarah thought you'd say that. There's a budget for tools in the 15 grand. First stop tomorrow, the hardware store. We're getting you set up again. We? You think I'm letting you do this alone? Sarah made me promise to keep you honest. I'm your project manager now, Brennan. Get used to it. Despite everything, the tears, the overwhelming emotion, the sheer impossibility of what Sarah was asking him to do, David felt something crack open in his chest. Not breaking, but breaking open, like a seed splitting to let the first shoot emerge. A laugh bubbled up, unexpected and raw. She planned this, every detail. Of course she did. Did you expect anything less from Sarah? No, he hadn't. Sarah had always been the planner, the organizer, the one who thought 10 steps ahead while David was still trying to figure out step 1. Even dying, even in pain, she'd been trying to save him. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for saving. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and picked up Sarah's letter again, rereading the postscript. Now stop crying and go call Marcia. He looked up at Marcia, who was watching him with eyes that held both grief and hope in equal measure. Okay, he said, and the word felt like a vow. Okay. Tomorrow we go to the hardware store. Tomorrow we start building your life back, Marcia corrected. The hardware store is just the beginning. David hadn't been inside a hardware store in 3 years. He'd avoided them the way a recovering alcoholic avoids bars, not because he was tempted, but because the memory of what he'd lost was too painful to face. The smell alone was enough to undo him. Fresh-cut lumber, machine oil, the metallic tang of new tools. Walking into Portland Hardware at 8 a.m. on a grey Tuesday morning felt like stepping into a church after years of apostasy. The store was massive, a warehouse-style space with soaring ceilings and aisles that stretched impossibly long. Marcia walked beside him, practical and focused, pushing a cart. She had a list, of course she had a list, broken down by project, with estimated costs and specific tool requirements. Sarah had probably made it years ago, anticipating everything David would need. Hand tools first, Marcia said, consulting her phone. Hammer, saw, chisels, planes, measuring tools, the basics. David followed her in a daze, running his fingers along the displays. Everything had changed and nothing had changed. The tools were better now, more ergonomic handles, better materials, but they were fundamentally the same. A hammer was still a hammer. A saw was still a saw. The principles hadn't changed in 100 years. A young employee approached, early 20s, wearing an orange apron, eager to help. Finding everything okay? We're looking for hand tools, Marcia said. Starting a carpentry project. The kid's face lit up. Oh, awesome. Are you a professional carpenter? He was looking at David. David opened his mouth, then closed it. What was he supposed to say? I used to be. I threw it all away. I'm trying to remember who I was. He's the best carpenter in Portland, Marcia said firmly, and the certainty in her voice made David's throat tighten. We're just replacing some equipment he lost. Lost. Such a generous word for sold in a fit of self-destructive despair. The kid showed them to the hand tool section, pointing out various options. David picked up a hammer. 16 ounces, hickory handle, drop-forged steel head. The weight was perfect, balanced exactly right. He swung it experimentally, testing the feel. His hand remembered the motion even if his mind was rusty. That's a good choice, the kid said. That's our best-selling model. David set it in the cart. Then a 26-inch handsaw with a hardwood handle. A set of chisels ranging from 1/4 inch to 2 inches, their edges factory sharp. A block plane for fine work. A tape measure. a combination square, a level. Each tool felt like putting on clothes that had been packed away too long. Familiar but strange, comfortable but requiring adjustment. By the time they reached the checkout, the cart was full and the total was pushing $800. David felt nauseated looking at the receipt. That was more than half of what he usually spent on groceries in a month. More than he'd spent on anything except rent and alcohol since Sarah died. But Marcia swiped a debit card, presumably the one connected to Sarah's trust fund, without hesitation. "This is what the money's for," she reminded him, seeing his discomfort. "This is exactly what Sarah wanted." They loaded the tools into Marcia's car, a sensible Honda, with enough trunk space to accommodate their purchases. David sat in the passenger seat, surrounded by bags and boxes, feeling like he'd crossed some threshold he couldn't quite name. Buying tools was a commitment. It meant he intended to use them. It meant he was going to try. "Nervous?" Marcia asked as she pulled out of the parking lot. "Terrified," David admitted. "Good. That means you care." She glanced at him, her expression softening. "Sarah knew you'd be scared. She told me to tell you that scared is okay. Scared means it matters." David stared out the window at Portland passing by. The rain had stopped, leaving everything wet and gleaming. The city looked scrubbed clean, ready for something new. It was the kind of space that shouldn't exist in a city. A pocket of green where neighbors grew tomatoes and zucchini and herbs, where kids learned where food came from, where elderly immigrants planted seeds from their home countries and coaxed them into life in Oregon's temperamental climate. David had never been here before, but Sarah had. He found that out when he met the garden coordinator, a woman named Ruth who looked to be in her 60s, with sun-weathered skin and dirt permanently embedded under her fingernails. "You must be David," Ruth said, shaking his hand with a grip that made his fingers ache. "Sarah talked about you constantly. She volunteered here every Saturday for 5 years." "She did?" David felt like he'd been punched. How had he not known this? What else about Sarah's life had he been oblivious to while he was drunk and self-pitying? Every Saturday morning, she worked the children's section, helped kids plant seeds, taught them about composting. She was wonderful with them. Ruth smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "We were devastated when she got sick. The kids made her cards. I can show you if you'd like. We kept them all." "Maybe later," David managed. He couldn't handle that right now. "The fence?" Ruth led him to the perimeter. The fence was exactly as bad as Sarah's list had suggested, maybe worse. Chain link sagging between posts, some sections rusted through completely, gaps large enough for dogs to squeeze through. The garden had been dealing with problems, loose dogs destroying planted beds, people dumping trash over the fence, occasional theft of tools from the shed. "We've been trying to raise money for replacement for 2 years, Ruth explained. "But it's expensive and we're all volunteers. We can barely afford seeds and soil." David walked the perimeter, measuring by eye, counting posts, calculating materials. It was maybe 200 feet of fence line, 10 posts. Not a huge job, but not trivial either. He'd need to concrete the posts, attach proper fencing, add a gate that locked. 2 weeks of work, maybe 3 if he did it alone. But he wouldn't be alone. Sarah had known that too. "I'll need help," David said. "Volunteers, people to dig post holes, mix concrete, hold fence panels while I attach them." "We have volunteers," Ruth said immediately. "Tell me when and we'll have at least a dozen people here." "Saturday," David decided. "This Saturday. I'll have materials by then." Ruth's eyes went bright with tears. "Sarah said you'd do this. She said when the time was right you'd remember how to build things." There were parents from the children's section, elderly gardeners who tended plots with religious devotion, and a handful of younger people, probably neighbors who'd heard about the project and wanted to help. They looked at David expectantly, waiting for direction. He'd forgotten this part, the leadership, the way people deferred to the craftsman, trusting that he knew what he was doing. Did he? It had been so long, but then muscle memory kicked in. He organized them into teams, post-hole diggers, concrete mixers, cleanup crew. He showed them how to mark the post locations using string and stakes, how to dig holes deep enough for stability, how to mix concrete to the right consistency. His hands moved with confidence his brain didn't feel, his voice steady as he gave instructions. They worked all day. It was hard, physical labor, the kind David's body had forgotten it was capable of. His back ached by noon. His hands developed blisters that broke and bled by 2 p.m. His shoulders screamed by 4. But he kept going, because people were counting on him, and because stopping would mean acknowledging that maybe he couldn't do this after all. By sunset, 8 new posts stood in concrete, plumb and level. The old fence sections were removed, stacked for disposal. Everyone was exhausted, dirty, satisfied. "Same time next week?" Ruth asked. "We'll get the fencing attached?" "Same time next week," David confirmed. As people dispersed, heading home to showers and well-earned rest, Marcia lingered. She looked at David, really looked at him, and smiled. "You did good today," she said. Sarah would be proud. David wanted to deflect, to minimize, to point out all the ways he'd been clumsy and slow, but instead he just nodded, accepting the compliment. Yeah, maybe she would. The bus stop at 82nd and Division was one of the most depressing spots in Portland. It served a low-income neighborhood, an area where people worked multiple jobs to make rent, where the bus was the only transportation option for most residents. The stop itself was just a weathered pole with a route map and a trash can that overflowed weekly. No shelter, no bench, nothing to make waiting in Portland's rain anything less than miserable. David knew this stop. He'd taken the bus from here dozens of times over the last 3 years, standing in the rain with elderly women and exhausted workers, watching them shift from foot to foot because there was nowhere to sit. Sarah had seen it too. Of course she had. Sarah had noticed everything. Building a bench seemed simple compared to the fence. Just a rectangular structure, seat, backrest, legs. But simple didn't mean easy, and David found himself obsessing over details the way he used to. What kind of wood? How wide? How tall? What angle for the backrest? Should it have armrests? He spent 3 days designing it, sketching variations, calculating load-bearing requirements. It had to be sturdy enough to hold multiple people, weather-resistant. Difficult to vandalize, but not so heavy he couldn't install it himself. And it had to be beautiful, because anything worth building was worth building well. He settled on pressure-treated lumber for durability, with a design that was clean and modern but warm. The seat would be slatted for drainage, the backrest angled at 105 degrees for comfort, the legs bolted together with heavy-duty hardware and anchored to a concrete pad. Marcia found him in his apartment, which had slowly been transforming into a workshop, tools and lumber occupying every available surface. One evening, surrounded by sketches. "You're overthinking this," she observed, settling onto his couch. "It needs to be right," David said, not looking up from his measurements. "It will be right because you're building it. Sarah didn't put design the perfect bench on the list. She put build a bench. There's a difference." David set down his pencil. "What's the difference?" "Perfect is the enemy of done. And done is what people need. People need to sit down, David. They don't need architectural perfection." She was right, but it still felt wrong to do anything less than his best. Sarah never settled for less than perfect. You know that. Sarah wasn't perfect either, and she'd be the first to tell you that. Marcia's voice softened. She had flaws, David. She procrastinated. She held grudges. She once told me she'd wasted a year of her life on a relationship with a guy who collected Beanie Babies unironically. She was human. David laughed despite himself. She never told me about the Beanie Baby guy. Because she was embarrassed. My point is, Sarah didn't want you to be perfect. She wanted you to be present, to try, to build something useful, and then move on to the next thing instead of agonizing over whether it's flawless. The bench took 1 weekend to build. David cut the lumber in Marcia's garage. She'd cleared her car out to give him workspace. Assembled the pieces with methodical precision, sanded everything smooth, applied 3 coats of weather-resistant stain. It wasn't perfect. There was a slight gap where 2 boards met that bothered him every time he looked at it. But it was solid, functional, beautiful in its way. Installing it required permission from the City Transit Authority. Marcia handled the bureaucracy while David prepared the site, removing trash, leveling the ground, pouring a concrete pad. When the bench was finally set in place and bolted down, he stepped back to admire his work. It looked good, simple, sturdy, welcoming. The first person to use it was an elderly woman with 2 grocery bags, who sat down with an audible sigh of relief. "Thank God," she said, not to David, but to the universe. "I've been waiting for this for years." David felt something warm bloom in his chest. Not pride, exactly, more like purpose. Like he'd fixed something broken, filled a void, made the world fractionally better. "You're welcome," he said, so quietly she probably didn't hear him. Manuel Rodriguez had been one of David's best clients back in the day. A contractor who specialized in high-end remodels, Manuel had hired David for custom cabinetry on at least a dozen projects. They'd worked well together. Manuel appreciated craftsmanship, paid on time, never rushed a job just to save money. David hadn't seen him in 7 years. Calling Manuel's number, miraculously still in his phone's contact list, took more courage than starting any of the previous projects. This was someone from his old life, someone who'd known him when he was competent and successful, someone who would see exactly how far he'd fallen. The phone rang 4 times. David was about to hang up when it clicked. "Hello? Manuel, it's David Brennan." A pause, then warmth flooding the line. "David, holy shit, man. Where have you been? I tried calling you after Sarah's funeral, but your number was disconnected. Yeah, I moved. Changed my situation." Collapsed completely, David didn't say, "Listen, this is going to sound weird, but Sarah left me a list of things to do, and one of them involves your daughter, Clara. Clara, she's 3 now. Absolute terror. Best thing in my life." Manuel's voice held the particular joy of a man who'd found fatherhood later in life. "What about her?" "Sarah wanted me to build her a toy chest. Said you'd been a good client and it would mean something to you." Silence. When Manuel spoke again, his voice was thick. "Man, your wife was something else." "Yeah, of course. Clara would love that. When can you start?" They met at Manuel's house in Beaverton, a nice split level in a family-friendly neighborhood, with toys scattered across the front lawn and fingerprints on every window. Clara answered the door, a tiny whirlwind with her father's dark eyes and her mother's curly hair. "Are you the benchman?" she demanded. David blinked. "What?" "Daddy says you build things. I want a bench for my dolls." "Clara, we talked about this," Manuel said, scooping her up. "Mr. David is building you a toy chest for storing your toys. But I want my dolls to sit down. They get tired." David felt a smile crack his face, the first genuine one in longer than he could remember. "I'll make sure the lid can be a bench," he promised, "for sitting dolls." Clara's face lit up like he'd promised her the moon. He built it from cedar, naturally moth-resistant, perfect for storing fabric toys, with dovetail corners and a lid that stayed open at any angle thanks to special hinges that prevented slamming. He routed a pattern of stars along the sides, childlike, but not childish. He finished it with a clear, non-toxic sealant that left the wood's natural beauty visible. And yes, he made sure the lid could function as a bench, upholstered with a thin cushion, so Clara's dolls would be comfortable. When he delivered it, Clara shrieked with delight. She immediately began organizing her toys with an intensity that suggested she'd grow up to be either an engineer or a librarian. Manuel stood in the doorway of her room, watching, and David saw tears tracking down his face. "Thank you," Manuel said quietly. "Not just for the chest, for coming back. I thought you were gone, man. After Sarah died, I thought we'd lost you too." "You did," David admitted, "but I'm trying to find my way back." Manuel clapped him on the shoulder. "If you ever need work, real work, paying work, call me. I've got 3 projects lined up that need custom cabinetry. Nobody else builds like you do." The offer hung in the air between them. David didn't accept it, not yet. But he didn't refuse it either. St. Michael's was a small Catholic church in North Portland, serving a predominantly working-class Hispanic community. The wooden sign at the front of the property had been there since the church was built in 1952. Hand-carved cedar, beautiful in its simplicity, announcing Mass times and the priest's name. 70 years of weather had not been kind. The wood was cracked and graying, the carved letters barely legible, the support posts rotting at the base. It needed to be restored or replaced, and Father Tom, the parish priest, had been trying to find someone to do the work for 3 years. Sarah had known Father Tom from her volunteering at the community garden. Apparently they'd talked about the sign many times. "She said you were the only person in Portland who could restore it properly," Father Tom told David when they met to discuss the project. He was a slight man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle demeanor. "She said you had reverence for old things, that you understood how to honor the past while making it functional again." David examined the sign, running his hands over the weathered cedar. Someone had done beautiful work originally. The letters were carved with confidence, the proportions perfect. It would be a crime to replace it. "I can restore it," he decided, "but it'll take time. I'll need to remove it, take it back to my workshop, repair the structural damage, recarve the eroded sections, refinish everything. 4 weeks, maybe 5. "We've waited 3 years, Father Tom said. "We can wait 5 more weeks." The restoration became David's obsession. He worked on it every evening in Marcia's garage, carefully steaming and repairing cracks, stabilizing weak sections with Dutchman patches, recarving letters that had worn smooth. He researched historical finishing techniques, wanting to use methods that would have been available in 1952. He mixed his own stain to match the original color, applied layer after careful layer. Marcia started bringing him dinner because he'd forget to eat. "You're in flow state," she observed one night watching him work. "Sarah used to talk about it, how you'd get lost in a project, hours passing like minutes." "I forgot what this felt like," David admitted, not looking up from his carving. "Being absorbed in something, caring about details, having it matter whether I do a good job." "It always mattered, David. You just forgot." When the sign was complete, structurally sound, beautifully refinished, reading as clearly as it had in 1952, the installation became a community event. Father Tom invited the entire parish. Families showed up with cameras and children, elderly parishioners who remembered when the sign was first hung, teenagers who'd grown up seeing it faded and broken. David mounted it with new pressure-treated posts, set in concrete, guaranteed to last another 70 years. As he tightened the final bolt, the crowd broke into spontaneous applause. Father Tom blessed the sign in Spanish and English, his voice carrying across the parking lot. Then he turned to David and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is what resurrection looks like, taking something broken and making it whole again. Thank you for showing us that it's possible." David couldn't respond. He just nodded, throat too tight for words, and accepted the handshakes and hugs from people he'd never met, but who somehow knew he'd needed this as much as the church had. Eleanor Henshaw was 87 years old and had lived in the same house on Cedar Street for 62 years, raised 4 children there, buried a husband, watched the neighborhood change from working-class white to increasingly diverse and gentrified. She'd been determined to age in place, to die in the house where she'd lived her entire adult life. Then she'd had a stroke. The physical therapy helped, but she'd never walk without assistance again. A wheelchair was her primary means of mobility, and her house, built in 1957, long before anyone thought about accessibility, might as well have been a fortress. 4 steps up to the front door, no railing, narrow doorways, a bathroom she couldn't use. Her children wanted her to move to assisted living. Mrs. Henshaw refused. "I'll die in this house," she told David when he came to assess the ramp situation. "I don't care if it's difficult. This is my home." She was fierce for someone so small and frail, sitting in her wheelchair in a living room cluttered with 70 years of accumulated life. Photos everywhere, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, awards from her teaching career, 35 years as an elementary school teacher. Books stacked on every surface. "Sarah knew your situation?" David asked. "We were friends. I taught her in 4th grade, if you can believe that. Stayed in touch her whole life. She used to visit me every few months, even after she got sick." Mrs. Henshaw's eyes glistened. "She called me 2 weeks before she died. Said she was making arrangements, that I'd be taken care of. I didn't know what she meant until you called." The ramp was the most technically complex project yet. David had to design it to meet ADA requirements. 1 foot of ramp length for every inch of rise, which meant a run of at least 48 feet for Mrs. Henshaw's 4-foot front stoop. But there wasn't room for a straight ramp, so he designed an L-shaped configuration that turned 90 degrees with a landing at the corner. It took 3 weeks to build, working every day, sometimes until dark. Marcia helped when she could, but this was largely David working alone, measuring, cutting, assembling, testing. He built it from pressure-treated lumber with non-slip decking, added sturdy railings on both sides, painted everything a cheerful blue that Mrs. Henshaw chose from a color chart. The day it was complete, Mrs. Henshaw's daughter helped her navigate from the house down the ramp and back up again. David watched anxiously, checking for wobbles or instability, but the ramp held solid and true. Mrs. Henshaw wheeled herself to the top, turned around, and smiled down at him with tears streaming down her face. "I can leave my house now," she said. "I can go outside, I can visit my garden, you gave me back my freedom." David had to turn away, overwhelmed. This was more than building. This was literally changing someone's life, expanding their world, giving them autonomy they'd lost. No piece of furniture he'd ever made, no matter how beautiful, had mattered this much. "Thank you," he managed, "for letting me do this." Mrs. Henshaw laughed, the sound bright and young despite her age. "Sarah knew what she was doing, putting you to work. She always was the smartest person in any room." The Parkside Senior Center was a cheerful place despite its purpose. Bright colors, large print books, activities designed to keep aging minds sharp and aging bodies mobile. But beneath the cheerfulness was the reality that everyone here was old, and that meant everyone was intimate with loss. The director, a woman named Susan who reminded David painfully of Sarah, explained the concept. "We want a place where residents can write letters to people they've lost. Parents, spouses, children, friends. Something beautiful and permanent where they can deposit these letters, knowing they'll be kept safe." "Like a time capsule?" David asked. "More like a memorial. A physical manifestation of their love and grief. Does that make sense?" It did. More than Susan probably realized. David designed a box larger than any of his previous projects, 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, 18 inches tall. He built it from black walnut, with a top that opened on hidden hinges to reveal velvet-lined interior compartments. The front had a brass plaque that read, "For words that need to be said." The interior was divided into sections, each one labeled discreetly with categories: "To my spouse, to my child, to my parent, to my friend." The craftsmanship was some of his finest work, every joint invisible, every surface polished to a mirror finish, the brass hardware custom-ordered and hand-fitted. He built it as if Sarah would see it, as if she was watching over his shoulder, nodding approval at each carefully placed chisel cut. The unveiling was scheduled for the center's monthly memorial service, a gathering where residents honored loved ones who had died. David hadn't planned to attend. He'd just deliver the box and leave. But Susan insisted. "You should see what your work means to people," she said. "You deserve that." The memorial service was held in the center's largest room, decorated with photographs of the deceased. Hundreds of faces, young and old, spanning a century of lives. Residents filled the chairs, some with walkers, some with oxygen tanks, all of them carrying the weight of outliving people they'd loved. Susan introduced the memorial box, explaining its purpose. Then she invited David to the front. "This was built by a craftsman who understands loss," she said, and David felt every eye in the room turn to him. His late wife wanted him to create this space for your grief, your love, your need to keep talking to people who can't hear you anymore. It's his gift to all of us. David stood awkwardly next to the box, uncertain what to say. He wasn't good at public speaking, had never been comfortable being the center of attention. But these people were waiting, expecting something. "I built this because my wife asked me to," he finally said, his voice rough. "She died 3 years ago, and I've been trying to figure out how to keep talking to her. Maybe some of you understand that. The need to keep saying things even though they're gone. This box is for that, for all the things you still need to say." An elderly woman in the front row raised her hand. "Can we use it now?" "Of course," Susan said quickly, "and that's why it's here." They lined up. One by one, residents approached the box with folded letters, slipping them into the appropriate sections. Some were crying, some were smiling. Some stood for long moments with their hands on the wood. as if drawing comfort from its solidity. A man with a Vietnam veteran's cap came last. He held his letter, barely more than a scrap of paper, with shaking hands. "I never got to say goodbye to my brother," he told David. "He died in Da Nang in 1968, 57 years ago. I've been carrying this weight my whole life." He placed his letter in the "To my friend" section and closed the lid gently. Then he turned to David and shook his hand, gripping it with surprising strength. "Thank you for giving us a place to put it down." The final item on Sarah's list was the most daunting. Teach one person, anyone, your craft. Pass it on. David had never taught before. He'd worked alone his entire career, preferring the solitude of the workshop to the complications of collaboration. The idea of being responsible for someone else's learning, of having to articulate things that had always been instinctive to him, felt impossible. But the universe, or Sarah, or fate, had other plans. His name was Marcus. He was 16 years old, a student at Lincoln High School, and he showed up at Marcia's garage one Saturday afternoon, looking nervous and determined in equal measure. "Mrs. Chen said you might teach me carpentry," he said without preamble. "I'm failing shop class. I keep screwing up the projects. My teacher says I don't have patience, but I think I'm just doing it wrong and nobody will show me the right way." David looked at Marcia, who was trying very hard not to smile. "You did this?" Marcus's mum works at the dental office where Sarah was a receptionist. Sarah mentored Marcus when he was 12. She told his mum that when the time came, you'd teach him. So here we are. Marcus shifted from foot to foot, clearly expecting rejection. "If you're too busy, I understand. I just thought—" "What are you building in shop class right now?" David interrupted. "A bookshelf. It keeps coming out crooked. The sides don't match and the shelves wobble." David sighed. This was exactly the kind of thing he'd hated seeing in students, back when he'd turned down that teaching position. Fundamentals ignored, techniques glossed over. Kids rushed through projects without understanding principles. "Okay," he heard himself say. "We'll start with measuring. Tomorrow afternoon, bring your shop class plans and I'll show you where you're going wrong." Marcus's face lit up like David had offered him $1 million. "Seriously? You'll help me?" "I'll help you. But you have to listen and you have to practice and you have to accept that good work takes time. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir. Absolutely." Teaching forced David to be better, more patient, more articulate, more willing to let someone else make mistakes and learn from them. They met twice a week for 2 months. David showed Marcus how to read measuring tapes properly, how to mark cuts with a knife for precision, how to test for square and plumb, how to choose the right tool for each job. They rebuilt Marcus's bookshelf from scratch, doing it right this time, and the kid's pride when it came out square and solid was worth every frustrating moment. But more than technique, David taught Marcus about care, about why craftsmanship mattered, why doing something well was its own reward, why building things that lasted was a form of love. "My teacher just wants us to finish projects," Marcus said one afternoon, sanding a shelf with the careful attention to grain direction that David had drilled into him. "But you care about how it feels, like not just if it works, but if it's good." "Because people will use what you build," David explained. "They'll touch it every day. It becomes part of their lives. You owe them your best effort. You owe it to yourself, too. Your name is on everything you create, whether you sign it or not." Marcus absorbed this, his brow furrowed in concentration. "That's a lot of pressure." "It's not pressure, it's purpose." The bookshelf was finished just before Thanksgiving. Marcus brought his parents to see it, a young couple who looked tired but proud. His mother hugged David so hard he couldn't breathe. "Sarah said you'd changed her life," she said, crying into his shoulder. "She said you reminded her what it meant to create things that mattered. Thank you for doing the same for my son." After they left, Marcus lingered. "Can I keep learning from you?" he asked. "Like after I finish shop class, I don't want to stop." David felt something settle in his chest, something warm and permanent that he hadn't felt in years. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I think I'd like that." 6 months later. The workshop wasn't much, a rented garage space in southeast Portland, 600 square feet of concrete floor and exposed beams. But it was his, David Brennan's workshop, according to the modest sign hanging by the door, hand-carved walnut naturally. Tools lined the walls in organized chaos, new ones purchased with Sarah's trust fund, Others acquired from estate sales and online marketplaces as his business slowly, improbably, grew. Business. That was still a strange word to use. He wasn't trying to get rich. He wasn't chasing commissions or competing for high-end clients. He was just building, taking on projects that mattered, making things for people who needed them. The fence at Riverside Community Garden had become legendary in the neighborhood. Someone had posted photos online, which led to a local news story about the mysterious craftsman who'd appeared to help the garden. That story led to calls, more than David could handle, honestly. People wanting wheelchair ramps, custom furniture, restoration work. He'd taken on 3 apprentices now. Marcus, of course. But also Tanya, a 40-year-old mother of 3 who'd always wanted to learn woodworking, but had been told it wasn't for women. And James, a retired accountant who'd discovered too late that he'd spent his whole life in the wrong career and wanted to learn something real before he died. Teaching them was hard work, harder than building alone, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways David was still learning to articulate. Manuel Rodriguez had become a regular client, sending David custom cabinetry jobs from his remodel projects. The work was steady enough that David could pay rent on the workshop and actually save money for the first time in years. He still lived simply. His apartment was small, his diet unchanged, but he wasn't broke anymore, wasn't drinking anymore, wasn't wasting time anymore. Marcia stopped by most afternoons, usually with coffee and unsolicited advice. She'd become his de facto business manager, helping with taxes and invoices and the mundane administrative work that David was terrible at. She refused payment, saying it was what Sarah would have wanted. "You've become quite the local hero," she observed one afternoon, watching David demonstrate proper chisel technique to his apprentices. "The bench at 82nd and Division has an Instagram hashtag now. Did you know that?" "I don't have Instagram," David said, not looking up from his work. "Of course you don't. But Dumdura 82nd bench has 547 posts. People take selfies there. It's become a community landmark." David paused, considering this. The bench had been maybe 20 hours of work, $200 in materials, and it had become meaningful to hundreds of people, meaningful enough to photograph, to share, to celebrate. It was surreal and humbling in equal measure. "Sarah would have loved that," he said quietly. "She knew," Marcia replied. "She knew that your work mattered more than you realized. That's why she made the list." Every Sunday afternoon, David would stop by her house on Cedar Street, and they'd sit on her front porch, her in her wheelchair, him in one of the chairs he'd built to go with the ramp. They'd drink iced tea in summer or hot chocolate in winter and talk about everything and nothing. She told him stories about Sarah as a child, bright, curious, relentlessly kind. "I knew that girl would do something special," Mrs. Henshaw said. "I just didn't know it would be saving you." "She didn't save me," David objected. "She just pointed me in the right direction." "Same thing, dear." Mrs. Henshaw had become something like family. She attended Marcus's bookshelf unveiling, showed up at the workshop with baked goods for David's apprentices, called him every Thursday to make sure he was eating properly. He'd built her a new table for her kitchen, repaired her cabinets, installed grab bars in her bathroom, none of which had been on Sarah's list, but all of which needed doing. "You're a good man, David Brennan," she told him one Sunday. "Your wife knew that. I'm glad you're finally figuring it out yourself." David spent 3 months on it, working mostly alone late at night when the workshop was quiet. He carved it from white oak, incorporating symbols from Catholic tradition: wheat, grapes, fish, the lamb. It was the finest piece he'd ever made, worthy of a cathedral, though it would sit in a modest parish church serving working families. The installation was another community event, with the bishop attending to bless the new altar. David stood in the back of the church, watching people cry with joy over something he'd built with his hands. It felt impossible, like a dream he might wake from. Father Tom found him afterward. "I've been thinking," the priest said. "Sarah told me once that you struggled with purpose, that you measured your worth by your productivity." "Yeah, that was accurate." "I wonder if maybe you had it backward. Maybe purpose isn't what you produce. Maybe it's what you give. And you've been giving, David. For 6 months now, you've been giving and giving and giving. How does that feel?" David thought about it. How did it feel? Exhausting sometimes, frustrating often, but also, "It feels like I'm alive again," he admitted. "Like I matter." "You've always mattered," Father Tom said gently. "You just forgot for a while." David visited monthly to check on it, ostensibly to make sure the hinges were functioning properly, but really because he wanted to see if people were still using it. They were. More letters arrived every week. The staff had started a waiting list of people who wanted to read their letters aloud at memorial services. Susan told him they'd had to establish rules: no removing letters, no reading others' letters, treating the box with reverence. It had become sacred space, the most important object in the building. "We need another one," Susan said. "This one's nearly full. Could you make us a second box? Larger?" "Of course," David said. "But this time I'm bringing my apprentices. They need to learn how to build things that hold people's grief." "You're a teacher now," Susan observed. "That's new." "Yeah, it is." Sarah's grave was in the older section, under an oak tree she'd specifically requested. The headstone was simple: her name, her dates, and the phrase she'd chosen. She built others up. David sat on the grass next to the grave, ignoring the dampness soaking through his jeans. He pulled out a letter he'd written the night before, pages and pages, everything he needed to say. "Hey, Sarah," he said aloud, feeling foolish but continuing anyway. "I finished your list, all 7 projects. Took me 11 months, but they're done." A breeze moved through the oak branches, raining tiny green buds down around him. It felt like answer enough. "You were right," he continued, "about everything. I'd wasted 3 years, but not the way I thought. I'd wasted them by believing I didn't matter anymore. You showed me that mattering isn't about money or success or having a thriving business. It's about showing up, building things people need, teaching someone to do the same." He unfolded his letter, reading aloud, "Dear Sarah, I'm not good at talking about feelings, so writing this is hard. But you always said writing makes things real. So here goes. I was drowning. You knew that. Must have known, even when I was pretending I was fine. I'd given up on everything: work, connection, purpose, joy. I'd convinced myself that since I couldn't be the man I'd planned to be, I shouldn't be any man at all, just exist. Wait to die. Your letter saved me. Not because it magically fixed everything, but because it gave me a path forward. 7 things. Small things, really, in the grand scheme. But they added up to something bigger. Proof that I could still matter. That my hands could still create value. That my presence in the world could still make things better. I built a fence and remembered what it means to work with others. I built a bench and learned that simple kindness is never wasted. I built a toy chest and saw how my work becomes part of people's lives. I restored a sign and understood that honoring the past doesn't mean staying there. I built a ramp and gave someone their freedom back. I built a memorial box and created space for people's grief. I taught Marcus and Tanya and James and learned that passing on knowledge is its own form of creation. You knew what I needed before I did. You always did. I miss you every single day. The workshop is full now, full of projects and apprentices and possibility, but there's still a Sarah-shaped absence that nothing will ever fill. I've learned to live with it, though, to carry it without drowning. I'm okay now, more than okay. I'm building things again. I'm connected to my community. I have purpose. I have apprentices who depend on me. I have clients who trust me. I have friends who check on me. I have a life worth living. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for the list. Thank you for seeing who I could become when I'd forgotten entirely. Thank you for loving me enough to plan for my life after your death. I promise I won't waste what's left. Not a single day. I love you. Always. David. He folded the letter carefully and placed it on her headstone, weighted down with a small carved bird he'd made from scrap wood. A robin, Sarah's favorite. It would blow away or get rained on, but that was okay. The words had been said. She knew. I'm going to keep building, he told her grave. Going to keep teaching. Maybe expand the workshop, take on more apprentices. Manuel wants me to partner with him on larger projects. Father Tom asked if I'd teach woodworking to kids at the church. Mrs. Henshaw wants me to help her write a memoir, said I understand craftsmanship, and she wants her story built right. He laughed, wiping his eyes. I'm busy, Sarah. For the first time in years, I'm actually busy. And it feels good. Hard but good. The wind picked up again, moving through the oak tree with a sound like distant music. David sat with it, not rushing, letting the moment be what it was, sad and beautiful and complete. Finally he stood. His knees protested. He was still 57, still carrying the wear of hard work, but he straightened and smiled down at the grave. "See you next month," he said. "I'll tell you how the projects are going." The Silver Fox YouTube channel featured David's story in an episode that went viral. The master craftsman who found purpose after loss. It wasn't the story David would have told about himself, but it resonated with millions of people who felt lost, purposeless, adrift. The comment section filled with stories of people inspired to try again, to pick up abandoned hobbies, to reach out to communities they'd withdrawn from. One comment in particular stayed with David. "My wife died 2 years ago, and I've been waiting to die too. This video made me realize I'm wasting what's left. Tomorrow, I'm calling the senior center to volunteer. Thank you for sharing your story." David read it aloud to his apprentices. There were 7 now, ranging from 16 to 72. They worked together in a larger space, a proper workshop with good lighting and professional equipment. Business was good, not lucrative exactly, but sustainable, meaningful. "That's what it's about," he told them, gesturing at the comment. "We're not just building furniture. We're showing people that it's never too late, that waste isn't permanent, that you can always start again." Marcus, who was now 19 and applying to architecture programs, nodded thoughtfully. Sarah must have been an incredible person. "She was," David agreed. "But she wasn't perfect. She'd be the first to tell you that. She just understood something important. That purpose isn't something you find. It's something you build. One project at a time, one person at a time, one day at a time." He looked around the workshop, at the tools, the materials, the works in progress, at his apprentices, bent over their projects with the careful attention to detail he'd instilled in them. At the photos on the wall, the fence, the bench, the altar, Mrs. Henshaw on her ramp, Clara Rodriguez with her toy chest, the memorial box surrounded by seniors. Proof that he'd been here, that he'd mattered, that the last 3 years hadn't been wasted. "Don't waste what's left," Sarah had written. He hadn't, and he wouldn't. "Okay," he said, clapping his hands. "Break's over. We have work to do." And they did. Beautiful, meaningful, lasting work. The kind that builds not just things, but lives. The kind that echoes forward, touching people who would never meet the builder, but would benefit from his care. The kind that proves, beyond doubt, that it's never too late to remember who you are. David Brennan had wasted years, but in remembering how to build, he'd built something extraordinary, a life worth living. And that, in the end, was more than enough.